Alright, hello everybody, this is OmniGamer. Today I'd like to bring up some points of interest on something that has had just a deluge of information, but there's a lot of things that I think people are either misrepresenting, getting wrong, or just not understanding correctly. So that was kind of my reasoning for making a video presentation, however you want to look at it, on this topic. So yeah, let's dive into the case against Billy Mitchell's Donkey Kong scores, specifically the ones above 1,000,000 points. I do want to note a couple things. First, I am traveling right now, so I'm actually away from my normal setup. As such, I can't really do anything fancy, but I have most of the details here, so it shouldn't be too bad. I'm also doing it in one take, so we'll just see how it turns out. There's a link to the presentation in the description for the video if you want to follow along as we go through. Alright, onward. So, first of all, none of this is my own work. I have done nothing in terms of this dispute, this challenge, however you want to consider it, and really I have not contributed anything. None of this work that you're going to see in this is my own. So, just keep that in mind. I scavenged this from throughout the thread and put it into a place where it's hopefully the most significant points are easily understood. I am not a Donkey Kong expert by any means, so anytime that I bring up Donkey Kong mechanics, take it with a grain of salt. I learned everything that I present here only from what other people are posting, so it is quite possible that I might misquote some of the mechanics or how things work. So there's the disclaimer on that. And finally, this video is just meant to gather information. So all I'm doing is trying to pick up all of the different claims and enumerate them. I offer some personal technical insight anywhere that it's reasonable for me to give it, but it's really not intended to try and lead any of the viewers towards a specific conclusion. What I present here is everything that has been presented in the dispute threads, either on Donkey Kong forums or on Twin Galaxies, and hopefully this saves folks from trying to wade through that 180 plus pages of mess. So yeah, now let's get on into the meat. If you're completely new to this controversy whatsoever, a long time ago, and by a long time ago it's some 8 years, Billy Mitchell appeared at Boomer's Arcade in Florida, and on July 31st, 2010, he supposedly achieved back-to-back 1,000,000 point runs of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. So this is pretty significant for a couple reasons that I'll go into in a moment, but supposedly it was witnessed by a crowd. Unfortunately, there's no public facing recording that's available. The final score on Donkey Kong, which is going to be the focus of this video, was 1,062,800. There were two other performances, though, that you're going to see often referenced throughout the dispute. One is the 1.047 million performance. This was way back from 2005. This is what most people recognize from King of Kong, the King of Kong tapes that showed up. The next one is the 1.05 million, which is from a convention called the Brokers Convention in July 2007. Both of them are only available through a variety of unofficial leaks, and both were recorded via direct feed, which has some nuances to it, which we'll get into. So why does this even matter? There are 1,000,000 point plus scores on Donkey Kong that we're concerned with. And that's significant because they are basically the first scores that were actually credited, verified by Twin Galaxies and other places to actually be above that 1,000,000 point barrier. So it's a historical significance for the game itself. There's some administrivia going along with possibly some other players had achieved the milestone first, and Billy had either submitted over top of them or just to quash their attempts at it, but I'm not going to cover that right now. And the other big piece of this is simply because it is Billy Mitchell. After King of Kong, however many years ago that was, He became a fairly recognized name around popular culture and gaming, just associated with this kind of persona that he put on. And really, it's just something that heightens the intrigue and drama simply because a lot of people recognize, hey, it's Billy Mitchell. He's that guy who's a jerk from King of Kong. And they either want to see him burn, or they have this hidden burning behind Billy Mitchell and supporting him. So it's just something that raises the drama factor of this. And really, those are the main reasons that this matters to anybody. So, the charges. This is what is claimed by Billy, is that each of those performances, including the 104 and 105, were done live on original arcade hardware. The challenge, and this was started by username Zelnia and several others who worked out the bulk of the evidence for this, they alleged that the performances were in fact performed on MAME, which is Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, or at least historically that's what it was called. It's a very popular emulator for arcade games, and likely there weren't any live performances of these at all. And this is significant simply because MAME performances are tracked separately from original hardware, and original hardware verification process is really strict. There's a lot of stuff that has to go into it, and it's kind of painful to actually try and go through. But the big thing is that anytime that you're claiming to do arcade, but in fact using MAME, there's other advantages that might allow you to do. For example, abusing save states, and several other tweaks to be able to fine-tune your gameplay without actually having any risk. So those are the claims. Let's look at the evidence. I'm going to start out with what the most significant pieces are. Like, these are the critical pieces of evidence on which everything else kind of hinges. And so far, it has no counter. So let's get technical for a little bit. The big smoking gun here are the MAME transitions. And what you have here are four transitions across four different versions of MAME. So they cover from 1.115 and earlier, all the way through two separate iterations from 116 to 121, 122 to 126, and then 127 and later. And what's happening here is that as MAME development progressed, they made various changes to try and make it more accurate to original hardware. Unfortunately, a lot of times it wasn't very accurate at all, but these changes resulted in some very quirky or notable differences between the different versions. So they have their own hallmarks where you'd actually be able to notice specific ways that it renders things to the screen that clearly indicate it being a certain version of MAME. So the main one that we're going to be focusing on here are these first two, the 115 and the 116 to 121. So in particular, you want to notice this 3 girder setup. So this is a particular hallmark of MAME. There's a lot of other nuance to how it's actually populating, how the game populates the screen versus how the screen is actually drawn, and that is accounted for, but for the sake of simplicity, we're just sticking with the most notable piece. And for MAME 116, this girder has a little finger drawn on it, and that is particularly notable. This is the only version that produces that kind of effect, and it is nothing like original hardware, which would have a much, a known and different method of drawing. So with that in mind, be on the lookout for this little finger as we go through and actually look at Billy's performances. So on the left is the actual MAME transition taken exactly from recording on MAME, and on the right you'll see Billy's 104 and 105 million scores. And right away we can watch some of these transitions and you see that magical finger. So again, this is an artifact of just poor emulation on MAME's part and can only be created by MAME. This finger will never occur in original hardware. So that's a very strong indicator that the gameplay shown in Billy's tapes is actually recorded from MAME gameplay. So what about that 106, though, the one that the challenge is actually being based on? Well, there's scant little footage from the 106 at all. In fact, the only known footage comes from onlookers at a Video Game Hall of Fame induction event. And they're basically just filming CRTs that Billy has set up to announce this new score. And from that, we have a lot less ability to actually track what's going on in the transitions. And in fact, just because the quality is significantly lower, we're not able to tell as clearly whether or not the actually there, but the drawing style, that is the hallmarks of MAME early versions with those 3 girders, is definitely apparent in his gameplay. To get a little bit more backup on that 106, we look at another stage transition overall, in this case the pie stage, which we have more footage of. And it doesn't have any particularly notable dead giveaways like the girder stage does, but probably the easiest way to compare it is just to compare what it should look like. So on the left is actually a complete recording from a direct feed of an actual cabinet, and this is what it should resemble, although give some leeway for different camera rates and rolling shutter and a whole bunch of other things that we'll talk about in a little bit. But the main thing that I would focus on, and this is just me, I have made this determination solely by myself, so if this is wrong, come at me. This is not the fault of anybody in the thread. But I look at this lower area with the ladders. You can see that just it renders instantly on Billy's play, and that's more in line with earlier versions of MAME than it is with original direct feed. And here's the same thing from another angle. It's again pretty poor quality, but you can see as we get through it that those same ladders still render instantly, whereas they should either render only partially or not in one complete swoop. But again, this is my own determination on this. If it's incorrect, any of the people who are well involved in the technical side of this dispute, please correct me. All right, so the transitions themselves are the keystone of this entire dispute and challenge. But there's a variety of other evidence that is still strong, but not strong enough to make the case by themselves. Having that backdrop of that the scores were actually created on MAME, though, it makes them a lot more plausible and kind of fills in the story a little bit more. So we'll go through that. So the first is the simple problem that, at least looking at the 105, there's excessive luck involved with the strategy that Billy chooses. And there's a lot more to this when you start talking about gameplay strategy overall, like what they're aiming for, how they're actually intending to garner the most points from each board. But I'm not going to go into that for now. Just know that there's overall suspicious activity with how Billy decided to play when going through this. But for now, let's hammer in on the luck, pun intended. So one of the ways that you can score in Donkey Kong is that you get hammer smashes. That is, you pick up a hammer and you smash the objects that are either appearing on the stage or Donkey Kong throws down or whichever. And it's pretty clear that Billy's main strategy was actually to go for an abundance of these hammer smashes, which not only award a random number of points, whether it's 300, 500, or 800, but the actual number of smashes that you're able to get is also random. So he has an abundantly high number of spawns on all of the different stages, and among that actually maintains a fairly high average smash rate or score as well. So a pretty outsized portion of his overall scoring comes from these hammer smashes. And just a statistical analysis shows that this is an extremely low likelihood of happening naturally. So, yes, suspicious. It's not enough to count as a smoking gun by itself, though, but it makes sense when if you consider that they were possibly made on MAME, and also that MAME affords other features such as save states, where you could go back and redo things until you got the luck that you were looking for. So, there's a variety of technical oddities that are occurring with the recordings as well. The first one that many people point out to is simply that there's no audio with any of the direct feed recordings supplied. This is suspicious simply because earlier MAME versions would have notably different sound effects than original hardware and be a dead giveaway. That said, it's also a fair point that it's very difficult to capture the audio with direct feed setups on Donkey Kong boards, so there is a plausible explanation for that. The next is that there's strange things going on with the 104 and 105 videos, in that they are captured with 30 frame per second progressive frames, which means that the full frame is exactly one video frame. This is unusual because most of the capture methods of the time would have resulted in a 30 frame per second interlaced video, which actually would have preserved all of the different frames, just overlaid them on top of each other. And what this ultimately means is that only half of all gameplay video frames that were actually generated by the game were captured. And this means that there's actually a significant loss of information in the tapes, but it's also just strange in terms of what set of devices would have actually caused that end effect. So, suspicious nonetheless. Another is that there's rate discrepancies going on. So early MAME versions generally ran at a flat 60 hertz, and they occasionally had slowdown depending on the user's PC, other resources that are going on. Original arcade play outputs at a flat 60.606, and it's a very minor difference, but it is enough to add up over the course of dozens of minutes of gameplay. And some cursory analysis of Billy's videos appear to show that they are at a different rate than the original hardware would actually display, but there's other plausible explanations for that, possibly in the conversion process or the uploading to YouTube and various other things could have actually rendered them at a different rate than they were actually originally recorded. And the next piece are that there were rotation issues with the videos themselves. So the 104 and 105 were rotated right side up so that they could actually be shown on a TV that didn't have to be turned on its side. And it's suspicious because the output from the board would natively be actually on its side. So you'd actually have to flip the TVs on their side to view them correctly. This is fixed in the 106, but as far as the discrepancies with MAME, this is actually a very simple fix. Literally the change of one command line option or one menu option to make it output this way. The last set of supporting evidence that I want to go through are these circumstantial things. So the first is just that the 106 score was allegedly witnessed by two referees. These are Todd Rogers and Morning Dove. And, Todd Rogers has had his own share of flack and falsified scores, so there's some doubt on just his presence and affirmation of this score to begin with. But the point of having two refs is that using the rules at the time, it actually allowed it to bypass the normally very strict documentation requirements for original arcade play Donkey Kong. Another thing is that the 106 was accepted by staff vote, which is highly unusual. I actually don't even know if this ever actually happened on TG before. It's unclear if any staff were actually able to view the performance before they were able to cast their ballot, and there's also some allegations that Billy had applied pressure or threats to some of the staff to encourage them to accept the score. So that's some instances of possible foul play there. What's next is this infamous Donkey Kong board swap video. So the story behind this is that in between when Billy performed the original 106 score on Donkey Kong and when he went on to actually play Donkey Kong Jr., they swapped out the board in the machine, and they actually had video of them documenting the process. So in the video, Robert Childs goes through and replaces the board that was in the cabinet currently, which is supposed to be Donkey Kong, with a Donkey Kong Jr. The problem is that it's very clear from the video itself that what he's actually taking out of the machine is a Donkey Kong Jr. board, and then replacing it with another Donkey Kong Jr. board. After this was first called out, there were some other suspicious things, like him removing all audio from the video, and there's also an unconfirmed report that Robert Childs has actually admitted that the video was staged at a later time, but there's at present no actual recording of this or otherwise, so that's unconfirmed. The final suspicious piece is that there's simply no social media presence from the event. To hear Billy tell it, it was something that was attended by a huge crowd. They were all behind watching. There were multiple cameras and different angles filming the whole thing, but hasn't been a single witness who has stepped forward. And even combing through social media from the time, one would have expected that this would have been a much bigger deal, but there's just no record of it. So that's also pretty suspicious. So now, we just went through the most significant evidence against Billy's scores. They have tried to issue a number of rebuttals. So let's take a look at those claims real quick. The first rebuttal that came up was simply that, hey, those aren't my tapes. So the simple version of the claim is that the tapes that people are analyzing, that they're looking at, aren't actually of Billy Mitchell's play at all. They were either falsified or tried to frame Billy Mitchell's play. A lot of the Billy supporters are pointing to the fact that these original tapes were likely sourced from Dwayne Richards, who is a former staff and ref with TG. They claim is simply not reliable, or he holds some grudge against Billy. And they place the burden on TG squarely to produce the original tapes, which they claim would clear up everything. The counterclaim on this particular rebuttal is that it would be exceptionally difficult to try and recreate a full performance that matched up not only the score of existing past footage, but to arrive at the same end score. There's a lot going on in Donkey Kong. It's really difficult to try and keep track of everything such that you can wind up with the same consistent score on a distinctly different playthrough. And there have been a number of refs who have discussed the handling of past tapes, and it seems pretty likely that they would have actually ended up in Dwayne's hands, but there's no other reason to believe that he might have gone through significant effort to falsify them. And again, this is only for the 104 and 105 tapes. As far as anybody can tell or can claim, there's been no 106 recording that was ever submitted to TG. So the next claim, it's a little bit more nebulous. There was this claim that any of the oddities that are seen throughout the technical nature of the videos and otherwise were really the fault of the components used at the time. The analog video capture chain that they were using just introduces a lot of these effects naturally. And the claim is that any native arcade footage that would come through this same process would end up looking the same as it does in those tapes. The counter is simply that this doesn't make sense. There's no way for a bunch of these same components to affect the video in such a way that it would actually change how the transitions of stages renders, or that it would change the order of population of any of the elements on the stages. So the claim is that simply is a non-claim. The next rebuttal is a bit more in the weeds, and it has to do with the fact that any of the footage taken of a CRT television as it's going through a normal display mechanism, there are some artifacts when you try and capture that with a camera, which also has its own mechanism for absorbing the light and transforming it into a digital signal. Overall, though, it's simply that there is some discrepancies that can be explained away simply because of this rolling shutter effect, which is what it's known as. A caveat, though, is that this only points to footage from film cameras. Direct-to-feed is really not affected. The counter here is that while rolling shutter is something that complicates being able to find certain tells on certain transitions, overall the effects can be understood and really accounted for, or at the very least backed up by either multiple instances of different transitions or otherwise. And to explain a little bit more about what this rolling shutter is, if you look on this image, you can see that there's a strange shift in the girders that kind of forms a diagonal line. This is an effect of the camera actually being moved at the time, and you can see it more drawn out evenly here. This is a direct determination of kind of how the rolling shutter would work, in that some objects might appear to render first because it's already partially drawn the following frame, but it hasn't reached all parts of the screen yet. Okay, so we're through most of the meat of the dispute here, but I want to spend just a moment talking about a couple things that have come up that really aren't relevant to this dispute. And this is important only because these items in particular have caused some confusion to folks who haven't been in the thick of the discussion, so it's worth dispelling some of the more common misunderstandings. So, the first myth is simply that this is related to Billy's ability to perform the score at all. There's an unwritten understanding that, hey, if Billy can go and play Donkey Kong right now and achieve these same scores, they should still stand. This incorrectly assumes that the dispute is really about his ability to perform these, and not that he, in the past, has misrepresented his videos as original arcade play when they were in fact MAME. Second myth is that the dispute is based on video quality issues, and this is just flat not true. The focus has nothing to do with the quality, colors, or otherwise of the existing videos, and instead focused on the stage transition process, which are unique in that they have specific tells that can differentiate original hardware from different versions of MAME. Third thing, some people were misled to believe that the recordings show signs of being spliced or just edited in post. This is not right. There's no credible signs of splicing on the original footage, but there were some instances of footage that was copied on YouTube, most likely incorrectly, that some people latched onto as evidence of a splice. And simply, there's nothing to actually back this up. So, no, the dispute is not based on trying to find any sort of spliced footage, and in fact, that would actually interfere with the claims that it's MAME, simply because you wouldn't need to splice a MAME-developed video. And finally, there are some misunderstandings about the order of events with Billy performing at Boomer, supposedly. And to really dispel this, no, there's no assertion that Billy went through some kind of crazy setup to have MAME playing on the cabinet while at Boomer's in front of the crowd and the rest of that. The more reasonable explanation is simply that he didn't play at Boomer's at all that day, and simply showed up so he could stage a couple videos and use it as credibility when and in case that the score was challenged down the line. So, we've been through a bunch. Let's wrap it all up. Cap it all off. The claim against Billy Mitchell is that he misrepresented his past scores. This is supported by a variety of miscellaneous evidence. There have been a number of rebuttals, but none so far can really put a lid on the case such that it would show that everything that has happened for a plausible reason that wasn't, hey, these were made on MAME. So far, this has resulted in Billy's scores particularly any of the scores over 1 million being removed from Donkey Kong forums, which is one of the main places where the evidence has been supplied and brought up. And they've gone back to the most recent score that actually had a fully plausible verification, which was, I think it was a 933,000 score, performed and adjudicated by numerous people who actually can testify that it occurred live. And there has been no action so far on the part of Twin Galaxies, who claim that they are still in the midst of investigating all the different claims of this challenge. Alright, so that's a wrap. I don't normally do videos like this, and like I said, I'm away from my usual workspace, but I hope this was enough to help out anybody who's trying to follow along and really understand what's going on with this dispute against Billy. If you have any corrections, additions, or other comments, I'm happy to receive them in the comment section on the video or on my Twitter. You can find me at the OmniGamer. Hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, take care.